So this is Amy Biemeck. She's going to be talking to you guys a little bit today. She's from Olive Crest in Bellevue, Washington. So if you could just give her a round of applause.
Hi, Freddie. This thing's more nerve-wracking than speaking in front of people, knowing I'm being recorded. There will be evidence. Well, hi. Nice to meet you all. Welcome. Thank you for coming into this talk. It's I love to have fun, and I speak at different events for different things, and I've spoken at women's events and youth events and trained foster parents, and I really like to have fun, and I like to joke, and sometimes things come out of my mouth that maybe shouldn't. And so my PowerPoint is really for me, because if I don't keep myself on track, then I'll just talk about all the things. But there's not a lot that's funny about this topic. And so I do like to have fun, but I also really like to have an interactive experience. So please don't, like, even the way this room is set up makes me a little uncomfortable, because it's like rows of chairs and me. So move around if you want to. Tell me if you need me to move the screen. I just want you guys to be comfortable. And I've been to enough conferences like this to know that it gets really tiring sitting and listening, even though you're sitting. It zaps your energy. So if you need to get up, move around. I'm happy there's a baby in here. So yeah, please just be comfortable. And I'll try to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. I promise I will not keep you past noon, because lunch, and oh my gosh, who can focus when we get to noon? So I'll try to run through these pretty quick and then leave time for questions. But please do not hesitate to pop a question in whenever you guys want to, and we can have a discussion and interaction. And I don't promise to know answers to probably most things, but I'm happy to field questions and talk about stuff. So just really quickly, I'm trying to get a sense of my demographic. How many full-time youth pastors in the room? Cool. And then how many other full-time pastors, senior pastors, anyone, associate pastors? And then how many like volunteers, lay ministers? Okay, awesome. Well, again, thanks for being here. My name's Amy. I work at Olive Crest Foster Care Agency. If you've never heard of Olive Crest, we're the biggest private CPA, which is not tax people. It stands for Child Placing Agency in the state of Washington, with our 3 offices combined. So we have an office in Bellevue where I work, and then Tacoma, and then Silverdale. And the unique thing about our organization is that we are a nonprofit, but we're also state licensed, but we're not identified by the state as a religious organization. We're a child welfare organization. So it's a really unique situation where we are allowed to be Christians and be overtly God-loving, God-fearing people in our organization, but we also have to fall underneath the rules of the state and their contracts. And so we have contracts and licenses and all of that stuff. So I feel like God has really uniquely positioned us to be able to help kids and families, but from a biblical perspective. And so it's really exciting what we get to do. So I'll talk about Olive Crest again in a second, but I'm a wife of, I've been married almost 24 years. I know, I got married when I was 10. And thank you for laughing. My husband and I actually were in youth ministry for about 10 years, and so you're my people. I got a bachelor's in social work and always wanted to do social work, but obviously served alongside my husband. We started at Saddleback Church in California, and then worked at 2 churches in Arizona, and then we're on the mission field in Kenya for just about a year, and then moved from there to Seattle 10 years ago. So we've kind of been all over the place, and I really don't ever want to move again. I love the PNW, and so I'm super happy to be here. So I'm passionate about all things, foster care, obviously, because it's what I do, but just serving marginalized communities. After having lived in Kenya, I volunteer for Compassion Prison Project. So we talk about bringing ACEs tests to people that are incarcerated, and I have a real heart for our homeless friends and immigrants and all those things. So my heart kind of bleeds for marginalized communities. So I'm happy to be able to share with you a little bit. So what we're going to talk about is potentially a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit scary. Not this. This hopefully won't be uncomfortable for you, but the scenarios that could happen in your youth ministry or in your experience could be uncomfortable and scary. And so this is a good time to just like have conversations and ask those what if questions and stuff like that. So a tiny bit more about Olive Crest. Like I said, we're a nonprofit state licensed foster care agency. Our tagline kind of is dedicated to preventing child abuse by strengthening, equipping, and restoring children and families in crisis, one life at a time. So our head office is actually in California. We have offices in Riverside, San Diego, Orange, and LA counties, and then one little office in Nevada, in Las Vegas, and then our 3 offices up here. And so we have everything in California to up here from residential homes for kids. We have a house in LA and a school in LA, like an alternative school. And then mostly what we do is foster care. And we really try to put an emphasis on family preservation and reunification. So people do get licensed to adopt through our agency, but that's never the goal. We're not trying to push adoption. We're trying to push family restoration and healing and reunification. And then when that's not possible, which definitely happens, our foster families can adopt out of foster care. And like I said, we're a faith-based agency. We love Jesus, and so it's a unique position that we're put in, and there's a lot of like rules and contracts around all of that. But the primary place where we recruit families and volunteers and safe families, which is like foster families but different, is through churches. And so we have a lot of church partnerships in the PNW and in California. And I would love to talk to you more about what that might look like for your church to partner with us, volunteers, recruiting foster families, coming alongside foster families in what we call care communities, where it's like a group of people that just love on one foster family while they're trying to love on a foster kid in their home. And so I have little cards that says, what's your something? I always tell people in the world of foster care, I think it freaks people out because they're like, I don't want to be a foster parent. And I get it. Not everyone is supposed to be a foster parent. If everyone did that, we'd have way too many foster parents. So we do need more, but there's a something for everyone, whether it's being a prayer partner, contributing financially. You guys, I'm in the dark ages between like having babies and maybe having grandkids someday in the not too far off future. And so like I'm in the dark ages of babies. So I see a baby and I kind of go, oh my gosh. So we have 4 kids. My oldest is it hot in here or is it just because I'm sitting up here? I like feel a heater. My oldest is 22 and engaged and getting married this summer, so that's why I'm like, oh, grandbabies, but I'm not going to say anything to them because that's not cool. I'm going to leave them alone. And then an 18-year-old daughter, a 16-year-old son, and a 14-year-old daughter, so boy, girl, boy, girl. So I've always loved youth ministry because I love students and I love my teenagers, but I love you guys so much and just want to again publicly affirm and thank you guys for the work that you do because teenagers are awesome, but they are no joke. And, oh my gosh. It was really different being in youth ministry from having my own teenagers. So I'm trying to like apply the things I know to be good and true and right, but woo, they're a lot. So we're just going to dive right into the topics of abuse and neglect. I really believe that the church at large in America has bypassed this a little bit too much and has overlooked things that we needed to take a deeper look at and hasn't trained and equipped maybe their leaders or pastors well enough to be able to identify things like this and then know how to handle them because maybe we can identify stuff, but we have no idea what to do with it and there's not a process internally. Or externally for knowing how to help kids who might be victims of abuse and neglect in our communities or in our youth ministries. So just some quick definitions. The state of Washington defines abuse or neglect. This is a weird definition, but this is what it says from RCW, which is the Washington codes. Sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, or injury of a child by any person under circumstances which cause harm to the child's health, welfare, or safety, or the negligent treatment or maltreatment of a child by a person responsible for or providing care to the child. Broken down, a physical abuse definition is non-accidental infliction of physical injury or mistreatment of a child, and a good definition for neglect, failure to provide adequate food, shelter, clothing, supervision, medical care, health or dental, actions or failures that create risk to physical, emotional, or cognitive development of a child. What does not constitute child abuse and neglect is homelessness, poverty, or exposure to domestic violence if it's between someone else and doesn't involve the child. So that's kind of hard to imagine, but homelessness and poverty are not a reason to pull kids into foster care. It seems like it should be. And certainly if kids are in a situation where they're not getting fed, that's neglect. And so if poverty leads to that, where they're not getting their basic needs met, then it is. But simply being impoverished and not having as much as other people is not a reason. Any questions about this or comments or anything? Okay, so let's dive into, we're just going to go over some warning signs. This is a really high level, 45-minute, half an hour almost now approach to this. So there's a lot. Did you have?
Yeah. Lack of schooling. I know in some states that's considered neglect if parents aren't engaging their kids in the school system. Is Washington? I've heard Washington isn't one of those states where that's considered under the neglect.
Good question. Not by itself.
Okay.
But typically when kids are truant for a long time, there will be a truancy officer that's designated for that family, assigned to that family, and then the truancy officer will go through, a host of investigative type measures, and then from there, kids either get back into school and we put services in for the families, or sometimes that truancy reveals a bigger problem, which is there is a neglect happening and or abuse. So we had a kiddo just come into care who is 8, and he's at barely a kindergarten level because he wasn't going to school before the pandemic, and then he wasn't doing anything, and I don't know how he fell through the cracks for 2 years almost, but then he wasn't doing anything from home, and so this 8-year-old is just starting kindergarten and not socialized and stuff. So he came into care because of gross neglect. But they kind of go hand in hand. So it's not a reason to remove a child and bring them into foster care just because they're not going to school, unless they continue, to not be able to go to school. But again, usually that points to a bigger problem. So that's a good question, which leads me to these warning signs. We'll talk about these 4 warning signs of abuse and neglect. I have these PowerPoint slides printed out, but when they print it on the paper, where you can take notes, they're super, super tiny. And if you're like me, after something like this, you just throw the paper away. So I was like, I'm not going to make them. I'll have these handouts, but I do have them. So afterwards, please let me know if you want a copy of these slides, and then so you don't feel like you have to take notes. If you want them, I have them, and then we can always make more copies too. So I want to, we'll go through each of these 4 separately. But I want to make sure that we all understand that the presence of one of these potential warning signs doesn't necessarily mean abuse or neglect is happening. And you guys are all intelligent people. You'll understand what I'm talking about. But it's hard when we're talking about this because most of these things by themselves, there could be an explanation for that has nothing to do with abuse or neglect. Yeah. And so while we don't want to be callous about it, and careless and never report anything, we also don't want to be overly like, I saw a bruise on that kid, because oh my gosh, everyone gets bruised all the time, and especially little kids. Like, I always thought about this when my kids were little, because one of my kids was really athletic and just took a lot of risks, and the other one was like clumsy as anything, and she would just trip over her own feet, and I'm like, someone's going to report me because my kids are just covered in bruises. And I hear that a lot, and I'm like, no, that's not a thing. You don't get reported to CPS because your kid has shin bruises. So 4 main warning signs: physical indicators, behavioral indicators, those are from students, direct statements by students, and there's a reason I put a baseball emoji, and then statements or indicators from parents or caregivers directly. It took me a really abnormally long time just to make those 4 circles and things, and it's the only color in my whole PowerPoint presentation, so you're welcome, and now we have to move on. I always tell my IT people, I'm a social worker, I don't know how to do this stuff. So physical indicators of abuse and neglect. Will someone else read this out loud, because I am tired of my own voice already? Anyone want to read this nice and loud? Great, go for it.
Just about points.
Yeah, just the whole thing.
Okay. Physical indicators of abuse or neglect: unexplained burns, bites, bruises, broken bones, or black eyes. Student lacks needed medical or dental care, immunization, or glasses. Student is consistently dirty and or has severe body odor. Some teenagers just stink. Don't jump to conclusions. Student lacks sufficient clothing for the weather. Student reports frequent nightmares or bedwetting. Student has difficulty sitting or walking for non-obvious reasons.
Thank you. So again, not any one of these is sufficient to indicate abuse or neglect, because, oh my gosh, teenagers stink, and a lot of them, have things like this. I one time didn't take my kids to the dentist for over a year. So just, people are humans and things happen. But many of these together, or for a prolonged period of time, or when they're not being addressed, or when they're causing a lot of distress to a student, can be indicators that something else is going on. Can someone else read this one?
Behavioral indicators of abuse or neglect. Student frightened of parents or shrinks at the approach of adults. Student protests or gets upset when it's time to go home. Student habitually begs for or steals food or money. Student abuses alcohol or other drugs. Student's behavior is extreme, overly compliant or demanding, extremely passive or aggressive.
Thank you. So, again, there could be lots of reasons why a teenager might have one of these reactions or one of these behaviors or something like that. But combined with other things, habitually, over time, these would be things that should make some red flags go off if you're seeing them a lot. And then there's some direct statements by students which could indicate abuse or neglect. And this is the one that I put the baseball emoji for, because it just made my mind go, oh, maybe this is a good way for people to remember what I want to say about this. So student could have conflicting explanations as to how an injury occurred. Student reports an injury by a parent or other adult or caregiver, so they might just say, this person did this to me. Or a student states that there's no one at home to provide care. So I put the baseball there to represent an activity, because as you guys all know, working with students, the best way to really, have things happen, like God moments and moving towards a relationship with a student, is time and spending time with them and doing activities. So I thought of baseball because my kids, youth leaders, come to their games. They come to their lacrosse games and their football games, and they invest time into my kids. And because of that, my kids want to open up to them and want to share with them, because when there's felt trust and safety, you guys all know this, I'm preaching to the choir. So I just want to remind you that typically kids won't open up or disclose, like these statements, anything to a total stranger. I mean, I could take one of you out to lunch afterwards, and so we've known each other all of an hour, and I could go, okay, what's your name?
Abby.
Okay, Abby. So I take Abby to lunch, and I buy you your favorite meal, which is
Pizza.
okay, great. And so we're eating pizza, and I'm like, so Abby, tell me about yourself, and tell me the worst thing that's ever happened to you. or if that's uncomfortable for you, tell me the biggest sin you've ever committed. You're going to be like, yeah, I'm going to take this pizza and leave, because nobody does that. Nobody wants to disclose anything personal or private until they know that person cares. And that's old adage, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. But also, people don't want to reveal vulnerable or personal things that might compromise their own safety if they don't know that you're safe. So I just can't assume that your students, will all open up too. But in the context of safe, trusting relationships, oftentimes students will disclose things. And sometimes it will be indirect, and sometimes it's wildly direct. And you're like, whoa, I can't believe they just told me that. But you will be the holder and the keeper of information from students when they feel like they need to tell someone. Of the kids in our foster care program who disclose abuse and neglect, it's typically, if I had to guess, probably an average, we don't measure this data, but 2 to 3 weeks at the least, when they've been into a home. So 2 to 3 weeks after they've been into a home, we'll get calls from foster parents going, this kid last night when I was tucking him into bed and reading him a story just randomly said, my grandpa used to hit me on my bare legs with a belt, and just, good night. And our foster parents are like, what in the world just happened? We've had disclosures of sexual abuse by kids once they're in the home and once they feel safe. And it is typically when they are in the car driving and not face to face making eye contact, but in the car or walking or riding a bike or doing an activity next to one of the caregivers. It's never when they're like face to face and going, tell me what happened to you. Like, nobody feels comfortable doing that. I mean, that's why I think therapists have couches, because you're more likely to like spill everything if you're lying down looking at the ceiling than making direct eye contact with people. So that's just not the way we're wired as human beings. And when there's trauma that has happened, and I'll touch on trauma in a little bit, our brains won't let us just, go there with trauma that has changed our brains and rewired to go, this isn't safe. It's a fight, flight, or freeze mode that we go into. And so all that to say, if you remember that little baseball emoji, kids are more likely to talk to you about hard things, which won't always be disclosures of abuse and neglect, but they're more likely to share hard things with you and to really get real with you when you're engaging in activities alongside them and when you've proven that you're someone that they can trust and that won't let them down. So that's just huge. And then indicators of abuse and neglect from parents or caregivers directly. I'm assuming in your churches this is pretty rare, but I promise you there are things happening in every community and every church, and they're usually just under the surface. And most times when things happen, or even when we see things on the news that are just wild and we didn't know, our reaction is like, oh my gosh, I never would have known that, right? Like when you watch these things and everyone always thinks, not in my town or not in my church or not in my whatever. But things are happening. We live in a broken world, and things happen. So some indicators of abuse and neglect that you might hear from a parent or caregiver directly. And I'll just use the word parent, but caregivers can be, grandparents, relative caregivers, anyone else caring for the child. So parents might offer conflicting, unconvincing, or no explanation for a student's injury. A parent describes student in negative terms like evil, rude, or bad, not in the context of joking where it's appropriate, but still not funny. Parent blames, belittles, or berates the student in public. Parent uses harsh physical discipline with the student. Parent seems apathetic or depressed, which could be a sign of neglect. Parent is abusing alcohol or other drugs, also signs of neglect. Parent is secretive and or isolated or does not want to be known. So again, some parents are just introverts and don't want to hang out with everybody. And a lot of these, could have explanations behind them, but coupled with other things over a long period of time, this could be a red flag. Questions so far, or comments, or? Okay, welcome to the 3 R's. This is an easy way to remember just kind of how to keep things sorted in your head. Recognize, record, and report. So recognize those things that we just went over. Recognize that certain things might be indicators or signs that kids are struggling or have struggled with something. Record is the biggest one. I am in my 40s and I forget a lot of things that I think I'll remember when I go to the next room 10 feet away and then I don't remember. And so this is huge for me, and maybe you just have a short-term memory like me, but I have to write everything down. But a lot of times I've seen people get into situations where they then need to report something either to CPS directly or to a director or to a senior pastor, and they go, I don't really remember what it was. And I think it was that one kid that wears the hat backward, and I think he said, but I'm not really sure. That does not help. When we're trying to report abuse or neglect, that is so unhelpful because we don't want to go on a hunch, and we don't want to go on what we think we remembered, and we don't want to go on all of this stuff. So record. If you have a feeling, like a gut feeling, that something's off, I just want to tell you, please lean into that and then just pray and trust your gut and trust the Holy Spirit. That doesn't mean that the second that you have your, human intuition, which is flawed, that you go and, call CPS or whatever. But I just know that there's been so many times when someone said later, I thought there was something off. And I'm like, you didn't say anything. Like, where were you? And if kids are suffering and actively being abused or neglected, there's not time to go, I kind of thought a year ago that something was off. Like, that doesn't help. And so I would just encourage you guys, even if it's just private on your own, take a note on your phone, write something down in a private diary. But just like, hey, tonight I noticed that this kid, XYZ, they had a weird reaction when their parents picked them up, or they've been really disheveled, or they told me they just missed 2 months of school, but they won't tell me why, or just things like that, so that you can remember. And then if someone else comes to you and goes, hey, did you ever notice that this kid, you could be like, yeah, then this is what, I noticed and I wrote it down and this was when. That can really help. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about calling CPS in a second. And then report. For reporting, I mean, this is hard. Calling CPS, that's a hard move to make. And there's a lot of implications to that, so I can help answer questions if you have some. We'll talk about that a little bit. I know that for your camps, there's like a reporting structure. So it's like if you're a volunteer, you have to tell the youth pastor, and then they tell the senior pastor. And some things won't rise to that level, and some things will, and some things will need to be called into CPS, and some won't. But follow your reporting structure if you're, in a camp or some sort of setting like that. And otherwise, I would, encourage you guys to report to the appropriate person whenever you think that it's necessary. We'll talk a little bit about calling CPS. So, just curious, you don't have to raise your hand if you're uncomfortable, but how many of you have ever made a call to CPS for any reason? Okay, so maybe six of you. That can be really intimidating. Obviously, I have called many times now just because I have to for work for certain scenarios, but we'll just go over a couple of things, and please jump in with questions if you have them. Calling CPS, first of all, does not mean that anyone will get in trouble. And it does not mean that a kid will be pulled into care. There are thousands of phone calls to CPS in the state of Washington every year, and of those calls, only about 30% of them screen in. There's a screen in and screen out thing that they do, and of those, only about 8 to 10% of those end up with kids being pulled into care. It used to be higher, like over 10%, but there's been new legislation in the last couple years that has even changed the threshold for why we pull kids into foster care. So it's even lower now. We want to keep kids with their families, and we want family preservation. And so oftentimes when there's a CPS call, if it screens in, they'll do an investigation. The first line of defense is always, we want to help this family. It's never, we want to rip this kid out of this home and let someone else adopt them. That's never the go-to. We want to keep families together. So where they can, they'll put in like family services, family preservation, and they'll maybe get the state involved on a level where parents need to go to a DV class or go to drug and alcohol treatment or take a parenting class or something like that. Or they may ask one parent in the home. They may say, you need to leave the home. We need to remove you from this situation so that the other parent and the child can be safe. There's a lot of efforts they make before they pull a kid into foster care. So I don't want you to think that if you're making a call that you're going to totally ruin this family's life and or that it means that you're subjecting a child to being taken from their parents. That's very rare and very extreme circumstances. But if that does happen, then it needed to. So that's not a bad thing. There's a screening process. I told you that. The majority of calls are screened out. You can't get in trouble for making a report, even if what you reported amounts to nothing. Same thing with calling 911, which I'm not telling you to do. But I one time blew our barbecue up. And I thought I had the fire under control, and my adult son thought differently. And so he called 911 right in front of me while I was trying to, it's my youngest son's birthday too. He wanted me to cook brats, and I cooked them all the way. But the fire department showed up, and by then I had gotten the fire mostly out, and I felt so stupid because they rolled up and I was like, it's fine, I'm fine, there's nothing to see here. And they came up, and what I had failed to recognize while I was putting out this huge fire is that my grill was like 2 feet from my wooden wall of my house, of the outside of my house. So I don't know what I was thinking or not thinking, but they were like, no, we need to be here. Mm-hmm. And so they proceeded to ask me if they could go inside my home. They did all these tests on my internal walls to make sure that it wasn't too hot and that something wasn't going to spontaneously combust. And then they hosed down the outside of my house for like 20 minutes with my garden hose. Wow. And I was like, okay, I can see how maybe that was helpful. So I felt dumb calling, and I felt like this isn't an emergency. It's not a big deal. But what I didn't know, but there's other things that I couldn't see and that I didn't have any knowledge about. Yeah. And so sometimes calling CPS can mean that other people are able to go in and go, okay, you saw this and maybe thought it wasn't a big deal. But what we found when we went into the home and interviewed the family was this. Yeah. And no, we don't need to pull a kid into foster care, but this family needs help. And this family needs resources. And so sometimes that's what making those calls can look like. And you never need to feel bad for doing that, because ultimately, we want to help people, and that's what we need to do. The Washington State intake line is 866-END-HARM. There's also national lines that you can call that will direct you to your proper state, much like calling 911 directs you to your local emergency listings. And so, I just think better to err on the side of reporting than to leave a vulnerable child in a situation that they can't advocate in themselves for. So that's a really big deal. In the state of Washington, mandated reporters, these are people that have to call if they suspect child abuse or neglect. But again, it's just suspect. You're not the judge and jury. It's just you have to have seen something or know something to report it. You don't have to be able to prove it. You don't have to have evidence. You just have to say, this, I think, is not good. And then investigators and other people will do their jobs and ascertain. So employees in Department of Social and Health Services, which in Washington is called DSHS, or DCYF, Department of Children, Youth, and Families, law enforcement and first responders, social workers, probation and parole officers, teachers, daycare workers, school administration, therapists, and mental health practitioners. Clergy are not mandated reporters in the state of Washington, and I'm not telling you that to tell you that you do not need to call CPS, because that would be the equivalent of letting a person dying of a heart attack on the side of the road just die because you're not a paramedic. So we're not doing that, and I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is that you, clergy and church volunteers, don't actually fall under these. So if you're a volunteer in the youth ministry and you also happen to be a nurse, then you are a mandated reporter. Or if you're a volunteer and also happen to be a firefighter or a daycare teacher or something, you know who you are. You're a mandated reporter. But in the state of Washington, you are provided statutory immunity if something goes to court and you were the one that called. I just say that because sometimes people want to know. It's very rare that you would even be called to testify somewhere. It's very rare that you would even be implicated. When you make a CPS call, can ask to be anonymous. So they will ask for your name because CPS lines are abused often. And so they'll ask for your name and your information, and sometimes they might want to follow up with you or have more questions. But you can say, I want to be anonymous. And they don't share that information with the families anyway. They just say a concerned community member or something like that. So parents won't know who called CPS on them. If you're in a really close relationship and it's obvious, you know something that nobody else knows, they might suspect you. But again, better that than a child suffering somewhere. Questions about that? Okay. I feel like we rushed through those really fast, so I just want to leave space if you guys do have questions or comments or something, but I know we're getting close to the end. Yeah.
Okay, so say you call, so I'm a daycare worker, and I don't know the whole, situation with, taking pictures if there is abuse, physical harm.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know, because I know the last time they were like, oh, thank you, so much for, providing the evidence.
Yeah.
But I know in, some situations they're like, no, you shouldn't take pictures, or, so it's where's, that boundary of, should I, because the kid has marks on their bodies, or shouldn't I because I'm not, CPS, you know?
Yeah, that's a great question. Taking pictures of small children and babies is helpful, and they can't give you consent or say no thank you. Taking pictures of older kids, especially if their face is in the picture, you always want to ask for consent, and you never want to share that with anyone besides proper authorities that it would be important to share it with. There's not a law around whether or not you can take pictures of a child, and most times it's more helpful than not if you're seeing something. We take pictures of injuries to the kids in our foster care program because we have to document those, and they have to go to the social worker and to CPS if there's a call made. So I think yes, but also if you're a daycare worker, you guys probably have rules too. But just be aware that if you are ever going to try to take a picture of someone who's old enough to give consent or not, you do need to ask them if that's okay. And then just be careful not to share that with anybody else.
Okay,
And then too, when you call, this isn't in my notes, but when you do call CPS, it's really helpful to have as much information as possible. So you're not always going to know everything about the person you're calling about, but you can't just say, there's a kid in my youth ministry named Robert and he told me XYZ, because they're not going to know who Robert is. So we need a last name, we need a family name, we need potentially parents' names, we need addresses, phone numbers, because what they're going to do if it screens in, if it meets that threshold where they think child abuse or neglect is happening, they're going to need to go to the home, and they're going to need to interview caregivers, and they're going to need to, figure out what's going on in the home and if those kids need help. So gathering as much information as you can share with them before you make a call is really, really helpful too. Yeah.
I just had a comment on the mandatory reporting aspect, just as a personal conviction maybe wanted to share, just because we're not legally a mandatory reporter, if we're protecting those who are being hurt. I'm not a certified teacher anymore, so technically now I'm not, but I've always just said I'm a mandatory reporter.
Totally, yeah.
Because that's our job, is
Yeah.
to do that. So just as an encouragement.
Thank you for saying that.
For everybody else in the room.
Yeah, you all heard that. Yeah, thank you for saying that. Yeah, it's true. That's why I said it's kind of like the equivalent of like leaving a person dying on the sidewalk and going, well, I'm not a nurse, I'm not a doctor, so I'm just good luck. That's not what we want to do. We really are all mandated reporters. And as followers of Jesus and ministers to people, we're beholden to, to the moral, to the morality of what we're doing. I was going to mention earlier Matthew 19:14. I think you guys all know that verse where Jesus says, "Let the little children come to me, do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." The interesting thing about that verse is that I actually love is that Jesus in that verse was talking to his own disciples. He was like, y'all need to quit, because other people were bringing kids to Jesus and his disciples were like acting like his bodyguards, like, no, Jesus is too important and too whatever. And Jesus was like, no, bring them to me. Yeah. And he was like telling off his own disciples. He's going, bring them to me. Let me heal them. And that's kind of where you guys stand. You're kind of standing in that space where you're like, no, I'm going to bring this to the light. I'm going to bring these children in front of the people that can help them and advocate for them so that they can start to experience healing. Any kid in an abusive or neglectful situation has already experienced trauma. So you talk about trauma impacts on top of the abuse, and it can last a lifetime if kids aren't allowed a place to heal and aren't allowed safety. And so, thank you for saying that. I do consider all of us mandated reporters, but I think from a law perspective, people sometimes want to know, like, what do I have to do? Or will I get in trouble if I don't report? No, but you'll probably feel guilty for the rest of your life. Not even Catholic, and just kidding. I just want to touch really quickly. We only have like less than 10 minutes, so I want to touch really quickly on trauma. We do an 8-week series on trauma called TBRI, Trust-Based Relational Intervention. And if any of you know anything about trauma, you could talk about it and read about it until the day you die, and you would never really fully learn everything there is to know about trauma. I'm sorry, were you going to say something earlier? I forgot you.
I can ask you after.
I saw your hand. Okay. You would never touch on everything there is to know, but I would totally encourage you guys that if you have not ever read a book on trauma or delved into maybe your own trauma or addressed anything like that, I would really encourage you to do that. I think for a really long time, the church saw like therapy and trauma and then like Christians in the church as totally separate. And I really, really believe that God has enabled therapists and trauma specialists and neurobiologists. I think that he's equipped the people in the church to know this stuff and to be experts on this stuff so that we could glean some wisdom there. The beautiful thing that I love about trauma is that actually can be healed. Yeah. So we've shown that trauma can change the brain. I'm getting ahead of myself, and this is why I have my PowerPoint, because I just could preach. But we know that trauma changes the brain, and what's beautiful is that healing and integrating therapies to heal trauma can change the brain again. So if you've experienced trauma, or if you have a child that's experienced trauma, we're not without hope. And I think for a long time the world thought they had this happen, they're damaged, it's done. And there's healing that can happen, and we're not without hope. If we believe God for healing our bodies and healing cuts and scrapes and stuff, why don't we believe him for healing our brains, which he put inside of our bodies and on our souls? So it's a fascinating subject and something that I would encourage you guys to look into more. Trauma, just by a loose definition, the American Psychological Association, trauma is the emotional response that someone has to an extremely negative event. The word trauma is often overused or misused, and I say that because I think especially in youth culture, I just cringe. And I've lectured all my kids about this, like, Mom, oh my gosh, we know, stop saying that, we're just kidding. But my daughter was in her bathroom not too long ago, and she screamed and she ran out. She goes, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, there's a spider on the wall. I'm totally traumatized. And I was like, no, you're not. And she was like, you know what I mean. I'm like, but you are not traumatized. Being scared of a spider is not the same thing as trauma. So that word gets thrown around a lot, especially now. Also the word triggered. We're like, oh, I was so triggered. I'm like, no, you actually weren't. But actual trauma, it changes the brain. And neurobiologists have proven this, that trauma actually changes the way our brain processes and takes in information, and then the way we are able to respond to certain events. This is one of my favorite books, not from a Christian perspective, but there are a lot of other Christian books on trauma, but this book is so good. It's heavy, but it's also a good read that you can really get through. It's called The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Vanderkolk. And I just want to read a really quick excerpt because I think it does bring some hope. He says, we now know that trauma compromises the brain area that communicates the physical, embodied feeling of being alive. These changes explain why traumatized individuals become hypervigilant to threat at the expense of spontaneously engaging in their day-to-day lives. They also help us understand why traumatized people so often keep repeating the same problems and have such trouble learning from experience. We now know that their behaviors are not the result of moral failings or signs of lack of willpower or bad character. They are caused by actual changes in the brain. So a student's past trauma is not necessarily something you need to report, and trauma doesn't always come from abuse or neglect. Some people are just traumatized because of things that they witnessed or things that they went through, and so trauma is like separate from the whole abuse and neglect talk. But I just want to encourage you guys to also understand some of the signs of trauma, because a lot of your students are walking around traumatized and don't have anyone to talk to about the trauma that they went through. And so the same way that relationship and trust can build a place and a safe space for them to be able to disclose abuse and neglect, they could also maybe disclose past trauma to you, and then in that process begin to heal from some of it. I also would venture to say that most people in this room have experienced trauma on some level. And so I'd encourage you guys too, as you're ministering to the students in your care, minister to yourselves too. Get help for yourselves. Go to therapy, read a book, pray through how God might want you to move through any trauma that you might have experienced, because it's for us and our healing, and then for the next generation that we can impart the hope that God offers in being able to heal our hearts and our minds and our brains. So a lot of people feel like if it's behind them enough that they can move forward, and I'm guilty of that too. I've totally experienced that in my own life. I promise it doesn't go away, and I don't say that to be like doomsday, but the way that our brains change when we experience significant trauma, it does not go away. It can be repressed for a really long time, but it's going to pop back up when something triggers us, or when something happens, or maybe you're listening to someone else's trauma, and then boom, there it is, and you're like, why do I not feel safe in my body right now, and why do I not know how to react or not want to be here? And that's why. So I just would really encourage you guys, please know that you're worthy and valuable enough to start to heal and process things like that yourself. So just really quickly, a couple behaviors that might pop up from potential trauma, just so you guys can kind of see how this might work. There might be a student in your youth group who always has to be in the front of the line for food, takes more food than everyone else, or always gets seconds. Any of you ever seen a kid like that?
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of my kids, honestly, but he just does that. But it also could be, does anyone have an idea of why a child that has past trauma might behave like that?
They didn't get into survival.
Yeah, so there could be food insecurity that they grew up with. My husband's parents adopted 4 kids when he was 16, so he has 4 younger siblings that all came from the same mom that ended up having 13 kids in total. And they were all severely neglected. And one night my mother-in-law said she got up, it was right after the kids had all come into their home, and Danny, who was 5 at the time, was in the fridge eating a cube of butter. And Danny grew up to be an amazing man, and we love him, and we always tease him like, Danny, you want some butter? But he's done a lot of work to heal and process, so we don't just like totally make fun of people that have had trauma experiences. But it led us to talk about food insecurity and how he never knew the next time he was going to get food. He mostly was raised until he was 2 on Cheetos and Kool-Aid. And so for him, was like, I've got to get the next thing. A ton of kids in our foster care homes, they hoard food. Foster parents will find, chips and all sorts of food in their closet and under their bed and hidden in bathroom cupboards because they don't know that they're going to get enough the next time. And a kid in your youth group might be displaying this too. Again, a lot of teenagers are just really hungry and really selfish, and so it might be nothing, but it might be this. And so that could be another potential warning sign that maybe they're not experiencing abuse or neglect now, but maybe they have in their past some trauma around food insecurity. And then maybe a student who is clingy, wants to be best friends with every adult, and or is indiscriminate about which adults they trust or latch on to. Again, some kids are just like that, but that also could be an indication of some early attachment issues and some trauma when they were younger. There's a whole nother big thing that we could talk about regarding trauma and attachment, and how if kids and babies don't attach securely to a caregiver when they're little, they will have attachment issues their whole life, and that can play out relationally and socially in a lot of different ways that can be really difficult to deal with. And so instead of going, okay, that kid is so weird, or they're so clingy, or they're so annoying, because we know those kids are in every youth ministry, maybe kind of flip the script and go, I wonder what's behind that. And I wonder what their story is, because behind every behavior is a story. And so instead of just kind of boxing kids in of like, he's weird, or he's selfish, or he's annoying, or she, sorry, I keep saying he. Oops. There's a story behind there. And then maybe a student who is fearful of adults or untrusting. That's kind of obvious. And then students who often talk about sex and or more mature subjects with peers and or leaders, sometimes to get a reaction. A lot of times those kids could have been victims of either witnessing sexual abuse or being a victim of it themselves. Super hard to talk about, but again, in trusting relationships, you might have a student who discloses something to you that does need to be reported. It's 12:01. Okay. I know that was a lot. I know that was heavy. I do have the notes if you want. I wish I had like 2 or 3 hours with you guys, even though you probably don't wish that. But I hope it was helpful, and thank you for being here and for being people that want to engage with this subject and to be able to help your kids more. Can I just pray for you guys really quick?
Yes.
God, thank you so much for this room of people who you have called and equipped to this really, really difficult work of working with students as they mature and grow and navigate the world and experience all the hard and all the good that comes with being a young person. And so I just pray, God, a covering of your Holy Spirit over every person in this room. God, pray that you would give them wisdom and discernment. I pray that you would help them to be lifelong learners and help them all to see the value that you've put in them and how much you love them so deeply as they're pouring out to other people. God, would you pour into them, and would you help them to see how worthy they are and how loved they are, and that they are worthy of healing of themselves, and that you want to heal things that are broken in our lives and bring wholeness and restoration. So just go with them, God, and equip them and bless them. And I just thank you for their lives. In Jesus' name, amen.